Doesn't the world writ large need a lot more mediators at every level? I mean, we are so lacking in that skill, aren't we?
We are. Um, but here is the catch, and that's an interesting one. Technically, if you look at the type of conflict resolution that sort of framework that I was active into, it is the product of a certain era. It's the product of one, the aftermath of the Second World War, and even more so of the aftermath of the Cold War, with also this notion that the more you did economic interdependency linkage, the more you could, sort of create peace. It's this notion of liberal peace, actually. Um, and mediators, as part of the UN system or the OSCE or even the European Union, the African Union, have inherited that sort of ideological DNA to a certain extent, with exceptions, but it's been a bit of the sort of running framework. That must be questioned. It must be investigated as to whether or not the framework still stands. Mediators, essentially, that were trying to negotiate different types of peace, which were essentially trying to negotiate political and economic equilibriums that had a tendency actually to inscribe further natural extraction within peace processes or peace agreements, that had a tendency to essentially rely on certain types of development pathways that would serve as backups, essentially, for the political processes behind mediation. All of this needs to be reviewed. I think that there is a lot of room for reinvention, not on the principles of mediation, right? Because mediation is a practice that is established within nonviolence. And, if you read, for example, the works of Galtung or other scholars who have tried to sort of, direct humanity towards what we call positive peace rather than negative peace. Negative peace is essentially the absence of war or conflict. Positive peace is what you create over time by essentially sort of like creating societies that benefit from exchanging with one another, from co-creating and co-imagining the future. And that is something that involves education, culture, arts, literature, etc., etc. But we have a lot of things to reinvent also in our relationship to one another in terms of societies, communities, etc., etc., but also as humanity towards nature. And nature was never actually really included within that notion of peace, right? So we do need a lot more mediators. We also need a reinvention of what mediation is supposed to do.
Hmm. Well, more what I was getting at is on top of our big biophysical environmental challenges, we have polarization and AI and GPT chat and things that are just splintering what normally people would agree on. And I almost think like teaching mediation and conflict resolution or co creation of positive peace as teenagers as a thing would be like a really helpful thing for humanity. That's where I was going with that question.
Yeah.
Were
And,
you always like an
since
expert in this, like as a child, or did you like go to university and say, "Oh, I care about this. I want to learn how to be a mediator"?
um well, I suppose that we are all somewhat influenced by our personal sort of backgrounds and family frameworks, right? And my family was very impacted by different wars, starting with the Second World War and then going on to the Algerian War of independence. So my father grew up in Algeria. Um, and I've seen the way in which conflict can impact people in very diverse ways and in very deep ways that inform their political view, that sort of, frame their psychology, their understanding of the world, their emotional resilience as well. And I was, I suppose, lucky to have, on the one hand, a maternal grandmother who had enrolled in the resistance and who was the epitome of life and bravery and purpose for me. And my paternal grandfather, who went to a concentration camp during the Second World War and who came out of it profoundly traumatized and who had a difficult relationship with humanity, in all sense of the word. And so observing these two adults when I was a child gave me a sense of the way in which, like each individual history can be marked by history written with capital letters, and how we're all a part of it, whether or not we want to be a part of it. We're all actors and observers of it. And I was lucky that, in spite of the difficulties that sort of both sides of my family experienced, I was raised in an environment where I was told that the future was Europe. And Europe was based essentially on this peace project. It was based on this notion of reconciliation, which is still ongoing, which we still have to reinvent on an everyday basis. And that became my first school. And then I decided to turn it. I mean, I was led, something was gnawing at me within myself. And I I let it lead me towards this path, which I'm still on, which is essentially guided by this question of what is peace. It's a very, very complex and philosophical question, and it's a very personal one at the same time as being a very political one. So it remains my sort of everyday bread.